Привit, my name is Alexa Gobosh, and today I will be interviewing Yaris Balan, our 14th alumni of the Alumni video series. Yaris Balan is the director of the Kule Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies in the University of Alberta. He is essentially a native of Toronto, where he completed his undergraduate degree at Scarborough College. Yaris later moved to Edmonton in 1975 to do a master's degree in creative writing, which he studied for 3 summers in the early 1970s at the Banff School of Fine Arts. In addition to the fact that he's a lifelong activist in the Ukrainian community, his academic specialties also include Ukrainian Canadian history, theater, and literature. Thank you so much for joining us. Our first question, what was your role in SUSQ or in your Ukrainian student organization?
I should maybe preface this a little bit by saying I became active in community organizations much younger through the Orthodox Church in an organization that still exists called Союз Української молоді Канади, SUMC. And I was president of the Toronto branch. I was on executives of the Eastern Council of the organization as well. And that gave me experience in organizational life. When I went to the University of Toronto, I attended Scarborough College, which, as you know, is a suburban campus and away from the main action downtown. And so my involvement in the SUSQ Toronto branch was more social in terms of the Toronto branch. What I did get involved in very early with is the Student, the newspaper. When it was first coming out in Toronto, I contributed some pieces. If I'm not mistaken, even when I was still in high school, I have to look at the dates, and through that involvement in Student, I also got involved in defense work. This was a time, the late 60s, early 70s, that the dissident movement had emerged in Ukraine, and there was a lot of community support of the dissidents. And so the students were active. They created something called the Committee in Defense of Soviet Political Prisoners, which I joined and supported. And then with the Committee in Defense of Soviet and East European Political Prisoners, as they broadened the focus to include everybody. So those are my main points of contact with the student, with SUSQ really, was through Student and through defense work.
And I know you touched upon this, but what were some of the other events or projects that you were involved with while still a part of SUSQ? Like, what was happening in those days?
Well, there was student life is student life. We had a good time. I was just trying to remember, there used to be pubs, for instance, and Zabava that we had. And I think that that's very important, that we socialized and interacted with the broader community. SUSQ had the great value of bringing together all of us who came from different organizational backgrounds, from PLAST, from SUM, from ODUM, from SUMC, from the Catholic community, the Orthodox community, as well as some other people who weren't involved, UNO as well, I should mention MUNO. And so it threw us all together, and we got to know each other and work together on common projects. As I said, my focus was particularly, I was interested in writing. So because of that, I gravitated to Student, both in Toronto, and then when I went on to grad school at the University of Alberta and the paper moved to Edmonton, I became extremely involved with it there and actually putting out the paper.
And what is your current occupation?
I am the director of the Kule Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Our mission is to research, publicize our research, commission research, conduct it ourselves, organize conferences, produce publications on Ukrainian life in Canada, on Ukrainian Canadian history, on Ukrainian Canadian culture, on the Ukrainian experience in Canada. So it's a position that when the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was established in 1976, that's just when I arrived in Alberta. And I ended up doing some contract work, editing work for the Institute in its early years, helped organize a conference or two, and then over the years did various contracts with them, and then finally in 2000 took over as the director of the Ukrainian Canadian program, which then became the Kule Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center. So I work really in the area of Ukrainian Canadian studies, but of course, to do that effectively, you have to work in Ukrainian studies. You have to know what's going on in Ukraine when the immigrants came So I'm a professional Ukrainian, you could say.
I can't wait to get to that point. Hopefully one day I get there. And how do you think your involvement in SUSQ developed your activism in the Ukrainian community?
It was huge. It can't be underestimated because of the kind of synergy, the atmosphere. Just as an example, when I moved to Edmonton, I ended up moving into a communal house called Dім Koskovich in the Norwood area. We were all students, mostly graduate students, plus others who weren't students, but who ended up crashing there. It's kind of a crash pad. And of course, this is the early or mid 70s, but the counterculture spirit was still very strong. The 60s spirit was strong, and all of us were shaped by that. And so it was both party central, and it was also a place where we got a lot of work done, where Student really revived under the editorship of Nestor McCook. I got pulled into it gradually and began to assume a bigger and bigger role in producing it and trying to broaden its appeal, which he did very successfully. So it was, I was also, involved in the local club in the Edmonton University of Alberta branch of SUSQ as well. And, but again, that was more for social things. And the political work was really done with student cultural work as well. One of the things we did was we expanded coverage to include Ukrainian dancing, Ukrainian music, reaching out into people with different interest groups in the Hromada. Our community is quite diverse. But it was a great opportunity to work with some very talented and committed people, virtually all of whom, or many of whom, I still maintain friendships to this day.
That's great to hear. What is some advice you'd give current SUSQ members or students involved in their Ukrainian student organizations?
The first advice I would give is that it's important university is a time for learning more about things beyond the classroom. It's not just about what goes on in the classroom. So the courses you take, all of that's fine, but I think you to be engaged in any kind of volunteer organization, student organization. One of the things that we, in putting out Student, we got to know the people who put out the student newspaper, not only in Edmonton, Gateway, but the Canadian University Press, CUP, this organization of student newspapers across the country. And we became friends with people in different newspapers. We were the odd duck. We were the only ethnic newspaper, and we were not confined to one campus. We were quite exotic, but it was a great experience getting to know the community, that community as well. So I think that getting involved in SUSQ in whatever aspect, whatever interests you, whether it's the politics or the culture or history or social things, take advantage of it. University should be a time of exploring, engaging in other things, and you might find you develop other interests that I know that in the student newspapers, many students who got involved in their student newspapers ended up as journalists, pursuing a journalistic career, even though that wasn't their original intent. So you never know where it might lead. And for me, my involvement in the Ukrainian Canadian, in SUSQ in particular, but generally in the Ukrainian Canadian community, ended up with me working at the university at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. Those were all the questions that I had for today. Thank you for sharing so much of your great advice and your experience at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. I'm sure it'll inspire many SUSQ and USO members. Дуже дякую вам.
Thank you.
Дякую.
Дякую.